Hello, everybody. This is Hyun Park coming to you from Amalgam Insights. Thank you so much for joining me today for TEM Expo Webinar 8, the Metrics of Technology Expense Management, Benchmarking Your Environment. This webinar starts getting a little more tactical into understanding some of the metrics that you should be thinking about as you benchmark your own process for actually managing expenses. And one of the reasons I've been doing this is that we have been digging into the strategy of technology expense management over the past 7 webinars, but haven't quite gotten into some of the details and metrics of what you should be looking for. Just as a reminder, these webinars are all precursors for the TEM Expo virtual event that we will be holding July 14th. Our goal here is to cut costs and save jobs, and with the goal of helping our attendees collectively save $1 billion throughout the rest of 2020. Obviously, this has been a tough financial time for everybody, and we want to be able to provide an event here at Amalgam Insights that helps everybody to be able to cut IT costs. So we're reaching out, going out to end users right now. We are inviting them. It's going to be a great event. It's going to be a free event for all qualified IT end users. We're going to be providing a combination of interesting events, cameos, giveaways, as well as care boxes and some charity work as well. So it's going to be that trade show event that you weren't able to get to earlier this year, as well as an opportunity to get educated on what you can do in the here and now, the next 60 to 90 days, to actually make a difference in your IT costs. Just want to give a quick thank you to our webinar sponsors who made this possible today, both MobiCord and Telenium. MobiCord is on the managed mobility side, as well as technology expense management built on the ServiceNow platform. Telenium, managed telecom and mobility service provider that made this research possible. So thank you so much to both of these companies today. As you know, we've been going through this massive labor shift in the United States. I went over this in the last webinar as well, but just as a reminder of how we have gone from the end of 2019, having 8% of employees at home versus today having 42% of employees staying at home. And then on the right side, you can see we were at 4% functional unemployment back at the end of 2019. We're now up in the 24% range, could be higher than that, of workers who are either unemployed or furloughed. We expect that most of those 24% will be going back to work by the end of the year. At least we hope so, but do we know that for certain? I think that one of the key issues here is simply around cash management of IT, making sure that we are doing what we can as stewards of IT to make sure that these costs remain reduced, and that we have to make sure that we are running good IT expense programs to make sure that happens. So remembering that we've got this IT rule of 30, that every unmanaged IT spend category averages 30% in waste. That equals about 1% of bookings, about 5 to 6% of payroll, or about 15% of your operating margin. But making sure that we prioritize our work correctly to make sure we get to that IT rule of 30 and actually manage that 30% of waste within each unmanaged IT spend category is the real trick here. So we know that based on where we are right now, there are 6 stages of managing COVID IT. Stage 2 and stage 3 are where we're at. We're into securing our business and auditing our environment to make sure that we are managing our IT environment in a cost-effective manner, and to make sure that we conduct all of our frameworks for IT cost management. So if we look at our past webinars, you know that there are frameworks for network and telecom management, for managing mobility, for disrupting your SaaS environment, for managing cloud cost management, key takeaways for invoice and payment management, as well as key takeaways for IT finance, which is different from expense management. If you haven't seen those webinars, I definitely recommend going back to the webinars 1 through 7 to get an idea of the frameworks that we are trying to optimize. Today's goal, though, is to talk about how to actually benchmark these efforts that we are putting into place from a tactical perspective, and have an idea of what you're trying to get to from a pure metrics perspective, and to make sure that you're doing your job correctly. So first of all, when we think about technology expense management as a program or as a tactical capability, a lot of it starts with invoice management and simply processing the bills. One of the most important things you have to realize, and that your bosses need to realize, is that the cost of processing a standard invoice is completely out of scope with managing telecom and cloud costs because of the extreme amount of detail. When we talk about a standard invoice that is processed, companies tend to think about this as being in the $5 to $10 range, which includes all the labor and all of the due diligence that is involved, because a lot of this is managing paper clips or other standard objects and services that happen within your organization and don't require much auditing. But here's the problem. When you look at this from a telecom or a cloud perspective, technology invoices are much more expensive. Typical costs that Amalgam Insights sees from speaking with a number of organizations. We recently interviewed 17 organizations for a research process and dug deep into their numbers and found that the average cost for managing invoices was about $10 to $20 for managing the invoice from a pure standard paperwork perspective, an additional $10 to $30 in parsing just to be able to dig through the line items and understand what was going on. And then we saw that organizations saw between a $15 to a $45 average late fee, depending on the size of their average bill, and that the majority of bills that were in unmanaged organizations were getting these late fees. So the real cost of a telecom invoice, especially in an unmanaged environment, it ranges between about $35 to $95. So that's about between 3x and 10x what you would expect from a standard invoice processing environment. That's an important thing to remember, because you're going to run into a lot of estimates for talking about the cost of managing a bill. And they're going to assume that the cost of a telecom bill is pretty similar to what you see in the standard corporate world, that $5 to $10, being able to get down from $10 to $5 to $3 by automating the process. But it's not that simple with cloud and telecom, with IT-based invoices, simply because the amount of detail involved and the timeliness that is involved and the lack of standardization that it often exists in this billing world. So just something to keep in mind, that the cost of processing a single invoice in the IT world is way higher than what you're going to see in corporate research, what you see from your typical procurement and IT research estimates that go into place. So why is parsing so challenging for a technology bill? Why does this end up increasing your expenses 2 or 3-fold compared to what you would expect from a typical procurement process and a typical invoice processing? Well, when we looked at this from a telecom perspective, we saw that analysts manage an average of about 645 line items per hour in manually auditing line items, looking through bills, being able to optimize those costs, and finding that the average dispute averaged between $306 and $800. That was kind of our standard deviation mapping of this. And as we looked at this, not a lot of line items that you can get through in a practical perspective in an hourly basis, and nobody spends all of their time painstakingly going through every single line item every single month, because it's simply beyond the scope of the time that you have in place, especially if you're managing tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of line items on a monthly basis. So because of this specific challenge that exists and the fact that there's a lot of detail within each line item in the IT world, it makes these invoices especially difficult to parse. And frankly, most companies are not able to look at each line item on a monthly basis. So we get to this point where these bills are both much trickier to look at from a practical perspective and that they are not fully reviewed. It's a bad combination, obviously. It requires, this honestly is a tool much better, is a process much better suited for some level of process automation to handle the vast majority of mapping, as well as some level of language processing or mapping to be able to process these invoices more quickly, and that typically requires some sort of technology support. So, average bill size is roughly $1,000 to $4,000 when you map the cost of each monthly invoice and look at this on a mean basis. Obviously, this is going to vary widely. You might have some one-off bills that are literally $10 a month, and then you have typically your master vendor bill on the cloud side or the telecom side, which is, if you're at a large business, going to be in the millions of dollars. There's a huge range here. Obviously, there's a lot of differences, but when you look at the average bill size, we're talking about something roughly in the low thousands range. And when you think about this from a late fee perspective, you're going to see 1.5%, 2% in late fees, which means that a bill like this is going to give you a late fee, at the broad range, talk about $15 to $80. I found that from a practical perspective, the range is slightly smaller than that when you look at this from a practical perspective. But these fees definitely add up over and over again, especially when you consider that vendors can send out bills up to 10 days late and then kind of end up retro billing you. And then, so right there, you go from 30 days to 20 days to pay. If you get the bill late, or if it's in a queue, you might get down to 10 days. If you haven't had time to look over stuff, all of a sudden the bill is late before you've ever even gotten to it. And this is very easy to happen in the technology world, where technology billing can be, and invoicing can be is all over the place in terms of quality, and you may not have anything specifically in your contracts to take care of that. So these are little bits and pieces of costs that end up coming into play for IT invoicing. Next up, talking about inventory tracking. So once you've got these invoices processed, you also have this inventory that you're trying to track. And we found that on average, it costs the company about $8,100 just to manage the inventory associated with the device. This does not include managing the actual devices themselves from a support perspective or from a security perspective. This is simply keeping track of the devices that exist and knowing who has what without going into any greater detail. And we found that auditing these environments of this size typically cost over $20,000 if contingency-based pricing was used. And we found that audits without further management typically got messed up again within 18 to 24 months because the organizations that had these audits ended up going back to bad practices afterwards in terms of not being able to manage orders, not being able to keep track of who has what, not keeping track of the data plans and other features that were associated with each device. So inventory tracking ends up being some practice that needs to be done on a continuous basis. And frankly, it is something that is also better done with some level of technology tools to help track and to help automate the tracking of inventory on a regular basis. Without this, it becomes both an inventory auditing problem as well as an invoicing problem, because you have trouble simply keeping track of what you have been billed and what you're trying to track going forward. So dispute management also needs to be cost effective. Small disputes need to be bundled and managed at scale. This is an issue that I've seen in organizations because it is easy to take an accounting-based perspective and simply try to chase down every dollar and every cent for its own sake. But in the process, it can be easy to get caught up in disputes that are too small to be meaningful while ignoring the opportunity to identify larger disputes. So with smaller disputes, there needs to be some sort of process in place for organizations to put these disputes in a bucket where you can either look for similar small disputes on other bills, or that can be pulled up to a minimum dispute level that is meaningful and should be pursued. But that said, disputes can be quite expensive to chase down as well. For large disputes, we found that a single time-consuming dispute could take up to $20,000 in internal labor to chase down, because it can take up several months. It was not uncommon for us to see large disputes take 6 months or longer to dispute, and this ended up including people from accounting, from IT, from legal, from tax, to from finance, to fully understand the nature of the dispute, the scale of the dispute, the details associated with the orders or contracts involved, and then to finally be able to collect and negotiate the dispute in hand. Disputes can be extremely time-consuming, and it's important to understand the resources that you need to be able to get these disputes solved, as well as the potential cost versus reward associated with each dispute that you have in place. Next up, we also looked at mobility management, simply the cost of handling help desk cost management, basic tier 1 mobility management. And we found that on average, when we looked at in-house management, those organizations averaged about $7 to $10 per month, whereas same services provided by a managed mobility services vendor averaged $3 to $6 per device. And a lot of this is simply due to the fact that managed mobility services vendors are able to scale this to supporting hundreds of thousands, if not millions of devices. And because they are able to scale this, they are able to specialize, and they are not simply trying to rebuild a support mechanism for each 1,000 devices that exist within an organization, whereas there's a certain amount of simply CapEx and startup costs that is associated with getting mobility management in place. So this may be something that organizations want to look at, although it's great to be able to outsource managed mobility at scale. The real opportunity for managed mobility may be, I think, is in the kind of mid-sized mobile fleets. Call it the 1,000 device range, 500, 2,000. That's a range where you start getting up to the point where you could have an entire FTE or more supporting mobility management. But at the same time, is it really worth it for your organization? Once you start comparing the outsourced costs versus the in-house costs, you start seeing that there's significant money to be saved simply in that total cost of ownership associated with managed mobility. So a few key metrics to think about as you're benchmarking technology management. First of all, that IT invoices cost about 3 to 10 times more than average invoices when you're talking about the total cost of managing them. That is just simply a metric that accounting and AP departments need to be aware of. If it doesn't cost that much, that means you are overlooking some major aspects of IT due diligence and are probably losing money in the process. If you're looking at disputes, start at the $500 range and up, because otherwise it's hard for this to be worth your time. It may be better for you to dispute specific smaller disputes by pooling them up over a several month period, or by pooling them up over all of the accounts that exist within a specific vendor. Make sure that exists first, and then do that in bulk. It can be very time consuming to manage individual disputes that are at very low number. Look for late fees that are in the $30 per invoice and above as a starting point if you've been dealing with an unmanaged IT spend category. So this typically means something that is in the $2,000 and up range from an invoice perspective. Keep in mind that inventory management is about 40% the price of one-time audits. Frankly, it is typically cheaper to maintain inventory management on an ongoing basis and check this up on a monthly basis. Make sure that inventory service orders are all matched up. It's going to be cheaper for you in the long run, although it means a little bit more work from month to month. It definitely costs less than the cost that it will take to clean it all up at once. And then finally, managed services, conduct the due diligence around your current TCO of in-house services compared to managed service providers. This goes across cloud, telecom, and mobility, simply because it's just a matter of scale. The fact that they are managing often millions of dollars in services compared to what you have in-house means that it is their core business. It is probably not your core business. So at least take a look at how those costs match up as you are benchmarking your own IT management capabilities. Thanks so much for your time today. Please keep these in mind. If you have any additional questions about this research or about our upcoming event, please feel free to contact us at temexpo@amalgaminsights.com or sign up for our event. We look forward to educating you more and to digging deeper into these topics as we both in our future webinars as well as on our July 14th event. We're looking forward to updating that TEM Expo information soon and to providing you more details on speakers, content, and topics. Looking forward to speaking with you soon. Take care.